Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent. Welcome, everyone, to a conversation in the Public Procurement Change Agent podcast and also done live here on Clubhouse. Today, we are going to talk about resilient supply chains. So it's a general topic as we come out of COVID, certainly in the light of some of the recent events with ransomware. It's only elevated the discussion about what it means to build resilient supply chains. Today, I'd like to ask Jenny to start, since certainly the current event is probably right in your box or near your box. So Jenny, why don't you introduce yourself? Why don't you, for people in the room who maybe are like, I still don't understand why ransomware is a thing and why am I hearing about it and what does it have to do with supply chain, any of that you want to start us off in, and then we'll go back around the room.
Great. Thank you, Dustin. Jenny Hedderman. I'm in risk counsel for the Comptroller's Office in the state of Massachusetts. So I come from a government perspective. And I think, the topic is such a great topic for this room because I think what we learned with COVID is that your supply chain really is your lifeline. And some of the lessons learned from that was that what we had put in place actually worked pretty well. We've been working to build flexibility into our procurement and contracting for about 20 years now, just because we found that the procurement process was very stringent, trying to get the best price, trying to be competitive. It often left us with less flexibility. So we were building flexibility language into our contracts and then working to have statewide contracts with multiple vendors. So you could have a plan B. You weren't limited to one vendor. So I think what's coming up now is not just the insecurity in the supply chain, which is not being able to get goods like PPE and vaccines, things like that, which were very apparent, but also how dependent we are on the technology of the supply chain at every single part of the process. And ransomware is kind of thrown a wrench into that, because if any of your suppliers are hit with ransomware, then like the Colonial Pipeline, they're down. And not necessarily from their goods and their shipping, but in the communications and invoicing and billing, which is their lifeline. So I think the lessons learned for that is the more we rely on technology to do our business and be efficient, and that really is our procurement process right now, then the more risk there is that there's going to be a ransomware or a DDoS attack or some other cyber event that's going to disrupt that supply chain. So building flexibility in having a plan B, not being 100% relying on technology. So if you go down, you have other things you can do to keep that process going. Those are kind of the things that are really being discussed and studied right now.
So Jamie, you were able to have your state CIO on, so I know you have a good relationship on that side. Is this a CIO issue? Is it a procurement issue? Tell me about how this has become something that is on your radar or not.
I think the question is really appropriate, Dustin, when you say, is this a CIO issue or a CPO issue? This is all of our issues. There is nothing exclusive to the CIO versus the CPO. And when we start thinking about ransomware, I'm sure that, as Jenny mentioned, right, just from a very unsophisticated ransomware gang that was just arrested in the Ukraine. I don't even know if I'm going to pronounce it right. The CIOP. They're not the most prolific ransomware gang, but they've hacked dozens of targets in the US and South Korea since 2020. And their methods, while they're somewhat sophisticated, but they're not really up there as it relates to most ransomware gangs. So if we start thinking about how do we, as procurement and the IT group, get together, how do we protect ourselves because shutting down the country's largest fuel pipeline for 5 days has a significant effect around the world. What would happen if it was 15 days or 30 days, God forbid, or a year, right? I mean, these things are not an easy solve. And Dustin, I think when you put the title of the group, Resilient Supply Chains in Public Procurement, that's just it. How does procurement develop that supply chain that's resilient to ransomware, to the Suez Canal issue that we had, to data breaches, to Brexit, to the US-China trade war, the pandemic, all of these things, right? It's more than just being that having that physical emergency preparedness with your water bottles and your beds and your masks and all the things. We now have to think about the way that we do business every single day behind a computer screen just to be able to function, right? If the internet goes down, wow, where do we go from here? So I do have a couple of recommendations to create resiliency, but I'm going to pause there because I want other folks to be able to chime in. And then when we circle back around, I'll offer my recommendations.
So, Jonathan, we did a lot of different reviews of COVID impact. You know, one of the things I guess that stood out to me in the projects we did for states, and we did one for Jaime and Connecticut and some of the rest, is just the vendor mix became so disrupted. The primary vendors on our contracts, maybe we were second in line behind the feds for some of the goods. We were having to create entirely new vendor communities on the fly. A part of resilient supply chains is, do we have redundancy in our supply? And in the past, maybe we would go down to one vendor because we could get an extra half penny off of a deal, but maybe that's not the game anymore. If we want to be resilient, does that affect the way that we contract?
Yeah, of course. This is Jonathan from the state of Louisiana. So I definitely agree. I think COVID forced a lot of us to reconsider what were some of the gold-plated notions in supply chain, you know, especially some of the ones that we had begun to take for granted, like the idea of just-in-time logistics. I think COVID poked a hole in just-in-time, you know, and there will be a rebalancing there where long-term we figure out how much of logistics should be based on what we need in the next 2 weeks versus how much should be based on what we're going to need in the next 6 months. It was definitely a reversion to some old practices when it came to that. I think COVID also had lessons for us to use the language you used in terms of redundancy, but also what Jenny was talking about with, you know, flexibility. And I think Jaime touched on it as well. I think it exposed the need to have a deep bench, like you mentioned, you know, with our desire to down select, you know, to not award to everybody, to, you know, harness best value. I think we need to revisit what strategic sourcing means in light of a pandemic. Is strategiig sourcing really about just saving money, or is strategic sourcing really going to become more strategic about where are our risks under each of these scenarios? You know, what is the probability, and, you know, what is the effect if it happens? I think in procurement, like in a lot of industries, we focused on the more likely and left the exotic risks off to the side. But I think what we've learned is that we can't afford to do that anymore. So what I would encourage is revisiting the idea of resiliency without taking away from what I'll call, you know, the hard infrastructure, the technology, et cetera, like what Jenny was talking about, but also the soft infrastructure of having a deep bench for personnel. You know, we have some people that aren't coming back, you know, that, you know, by the time COVID's over, they're retiring, having never come back to the office. So that's something to navigate, as well as a deep bench for suppliers, not having boxed ourselves into a corner with strategic sourcing such that we don't have a network of suppliers to help get us out of the box.
Yeah, Jonathan, I think one of the reasons that the phrase strategic sourcing had left a bad taste for many of the CPOs that I knew was we may have had lots of tools in the toolkit, but the only one that ever seemed to be pulled out was the one vendor smashdown. And that is something that's hard to maintain over a long period of time. Strategic sourcing should assess across categories. I think we've tracked in the past 40, 45 some odd spend categories that are in almost any state procurement office purview. So on a category by category basis, what is the right approach? In some cases, it may be super commoditized and we're able to come down to one or two vendors. And others, goal may be to add vendors. And so strategic sourcing should, as you said, be strategic and think on a category by category style about what is this market and why are we working it. You had also mentioned the need for redundancy and the issues with just-in-time. If Dr. Hanfield was on here, he would say just-in-time works, but it requires near to the factory type of presence. And part of the reason that COVID exposed the non-resiliency is that our supply was abroad or it wasn't close to our locals. So let me come to James, who's local in DC. How have you tried to make it so that there's local presence or local supply as well as larger supply so that it both has some economic impact on the region and also creates some resiliency?
Yes, and great topic. James Crenshaw with the DC Office of Contracts, and I work specifically for the Chief Financial Officer's Office. And we have taken several measures over the past year to get ahead of the curve with the challenges in the supply chain, particularly due to some attacks that municipalities have faced in a financial sector, just with COVID, with ransomware and things of this nature. One of the things that we've put in place, rather than going with some of our basic standard one contractor contracts, we've been using some staff augmentation. I'm using some indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts. And what that has allowed us to do is to hire some local contractors as well as some larger ones. And then when we have the specific needs, particularly in our staff augmentation, we're able to have a larger capacity, larger pool of contractors to use, both local and outside of the district. And it's worked out well for us, particularly. We've had some challenges just with COVID, with losing contractors leaving the country, things of this nature. So it has had a major effect on our financial supply chain to be able to keep our systems working. So now we're working on putting some security systems in place. Majority of our IT projects have been around resecuring our entire financial front for the district.
I'll ask Jamie to pick up where she left off. She said she had a set of recommendations that she's been thinking on related to this. So Jamie, why don't you pick up where you left off?
Gartner has some great examples for supply chain resiliency. If you just do a Google search for Gartner and supply chain resiliency, you'll find a number of articles that came up. There's three particular areas that I just want to touch on today in terms of how can we leave this call and start implementing these areas within our procurement shop. One would be inventory and capacity buffers. So we as procurement officials need to have the tough conversation with our suppliers and ask them, how are they preparing for inventory in excess of safety stock, or do they have underutilized production facilities that they can tap into, whether that they own or as a subcontractor, they can rely on somebody else. Now, these types of conversations often within the private entities are expensive, and the C-suite within the private entity, it's a hard justification for them, right? Because it's an additional expense to increase their safety stock or have underutilized production facilities. But the company should be able to come back and tell us as public procurement officials how they're prepared to handle those buffers. And then I would say draft it right into the contract. Make it a requirement that the company that you are doing business with has that safety stock. It's critical. It can also lead to a local vendor, right? Maybe there's a local vendor in your area that can that has some production facilities that they're not utilizing, right? So that I think it helps bring it all into perspective and come full circle from a nationwide supply chain or a global supply chain, to a more local supply chain. So that's kind of number one. Number two, I would say multi-sourcing is critical. If you think back to 2011, there were major natural disasters in Japan and Thailand, which disrupted supply chains across the world. There were cars sitting on Japan and Thailand that could not be shipped out due to missing components. And I think we're all experiencing something similar now, where these, fancy trucks and other types of SUVs and other vehicles are sitting in parking lots across the country because they don't have the appropriate computer chips. We can't get them manufactured and we can't get them shipped within the vehicles. So I think the recommendation for procurement officials around multi-sourcing is really know the supplier networks, categorize your suppliers not only by spend, but by revenue impact. If disruptive events occurs, add suppliers to your network. Or if that's not an option to contract with multiple suppliers, go to your single supplier and ensure that they have the appropriate contractual relationships with multiple suppliers underneath them with multiple locations, right? So if China gets taken out and they want to look back to Washington State, for example, or maybe they have a factory in Canada or Mexico, right? You've got to think broad and think big. And then the last thing, just quickly, is nearshoring. So this is really involving beefing up regional or local supply chains. Now, that's not an overnight fix. We all recognize that. We all understand the risk in looking to regional or local supply chains, that the cost can be more expensive. But the benefit is that you have more control over your inventory, and it moves the product closer to the end consumer, which is ultimately state government. So those are three areas that we'll be talking about in the state of Maine as soon as we get through our fiscal year end hump. So it's coming, but that's a quick, easy win, right, that we can all take back to our offices after this and think about resiliency, because we don't ever want to go back through what we went through in March and April. I don't think we're ever going to go back to that if we have the right conversation.
Hey, Jamie, you make some great points. Do you mind if I ask a follow-up question to what you said there?
Sure, go ahead.
When you talk about going to your suppliers and working with your suppliers, some of this sounds like it would be outside of the necessary day-to-day work for maybe a contracting officer or a specialist. Is this something that you have your team do, or do you put together teams for projects to do this and say, this is what you're going to be focusing on? Trying to figure out how I can implement this and start doing some of these things that you're talking about. These are great ideas.
Yeah, James, that's a great question. So my argument is that going forward, this should not be outside of our normal daily business. This should be part of the conversation that we have with suppliers as we're executing our contracts. Now, to go, right, when we have, I think the state of Maine has like 600 master agreements, and incidentally, one of my team members is here in the audience, Michelle, and we haven't even had this conversation. I know she's run into it on a number of times with some of our commodity suppliers, but we have 600 master agreements, and we're not going to go from June 16th today with no provisions in our contracts to June 17th and have all of these contracts include these provisions. So I think this is a strategic process that will need to happen over time as your contracts come up for renewal, or as you're having conversations, your QBRs, your whatever interval time frame that you're meeting with your vendors. That's the time to ask the tough questions. So James, to answer your question, we do not have dedicated resources at this time to start enhancing supply chain resiliency. It will be part of an ongoing conversation that our buyers will be having with vendors. But I do think it's a phased approach.
So Jenny, Jamie had a great list. I know that you're very into cybersecurity. We've been talking about some of our supply chains external. Also, we have to protect our internals because government is subject to the ransomware, and certainly government has to be considered a supply that is provided. Anything that you would add to Jamie's list?
So I would have 3 items. So one, I would presume that disruption is inevitable. And whether it's from a supply chain, from a product's point of view, or from a services point of view. And I think when people think of public procurement, they focus a lot on the products, but I also think the services, especially IT services, are going to be an area that are really, really important. So presume that there's going to be disruption in the vendors who are providing you with services. Either they're housing your data, they're a cloud provider, Microsoft, any of these providers, you just presume that there's going to be a disruption. Number 2, add language in your procurements as a matter of course to have them describe what they're doing if there is a disruption in services or goods, whatever's being procured. Have they done risk assessments for a disruption? And then what are their security controls? So you really understand, especially if they're in the service industry, that they have industry standard security established, and we're not just assuming that they do. And then the third thing is have language in your contracts, standard language in your contracts that talk about an event that happens or an incident of disruption, and that it allows you to leverage additional services, additional goods that they already have or that they can provide during an emergency situation. This allows you to use your current vendors without having to renegotiate the contract, and you can kind of hit the ground running. So even if you never use it, you just have that open door that has been through the procurement process, it's blessed, and it's part of your standard contracts. And I'm going to bounce it over to Christina.
Thank you, Jenny. All great comments. This is just a really interesting conversation in light of looking at everything from a rearview mirror now. Last year, I recall that I felt a sense of enhanced agency collaboration as far as the localized procurement shops around my locale, at least. And we do already have a local co-op in place here. We're lucky to have that. It's sort of tri-county. But, on top of that, I think that as procurement folks interacted more, shared information, especially on some of the more below threshold purchases like sneeze guards and things like that, random things that we never thought we'd need. And I'm just wondering, I want to kind of put this back to the team and see if anyone else felt a little bit more connected to the procurement people in their industry locally, and how have you taken advantage of that? Is that something that's continued? Do you have local co-ops that are helping you back up this area of emergency needs?
Yes. Right. That's the simple answer, Christina. I think this is it's a topic that not only local co-ops are talking about, legislators are talking about, the administrations are talking about it. It's something that we don't ever want to get back to. So I think like the Maine Manufacturers Association, or the Manufacturers Association of Maine, I think, is another big group in Maine that is leading the conversations for how do we bring those international supply chains more local.
Well, that's a great segue to the fact that on July 1st, we're going to have a LinkedIn Live with Rob Hanfield and then Steve Nichols from Georgia. So Rob is a very accomplished national thinker and participant in supply chain theory of all forms. He's out of the North Carolina State University. He was involved in the NASPO report recently on domestic PPE, and he and I have done one before. And then Steve is a very thoughtful person on technology as it relates to the actual implementation and how it touches reality. And so I think that there'll be two great people to bounce between. So I'm excited about that. That is on July 1st, as I said, at noon. That'll be on LinkedIn. So if you go to my profile, it'll show up in my banner, and then a week out, so the Wednesday, or I guess that's on a Thursday. So the Thursday before, I'll actually have the link to the direct stream if you're interested. So I guess I'll open up to if any of you guys have anything that you want me to take into that as a question. I've already built out a question set, but knowing that Rob is very involved in a lot of the national conversations, and Steve is somebody who certainly knows every jot and tittle about the way that states are preparing for cybersecurity and implementation. Somebody give me a question to take into that session.
In retrospect, knowing what we know now, was the federal government's role in the COVID pandemic constructive?
Constructive. Interesting. Keep going. What do you context the question?
With the benefit of hindsight, looking at COVID, was the federal government's PPE diversion ultimately helpful to the state governments, or did the resource diversion and allocation efforts actually hinder the ability of states to procure the PPE that they needed?
Interesting. I like it.
I would just take that one step farther, Dustin, and I'm racking my brain to think about the context. There was an agriculture type question I just saw recently, and I feel like it was a local farmer that said, hey, back in May or June last year, the federal government bought all of X, and it affected the agriculture farming to produce crops. It might have been hay, I maybe corn. I truly can't remember what it was. It might have been grain. But I guess the question that I would have back for Rob is, outside of the PPE world, did the federal government make the right decisions in buying stuff that helped the supply chain in other areas, right? And so you can kind of wordsmith it from there, but you get the general context. Like, they bought stuff and they thought it would help, and I don't know if it helped or not. So I'm curious what Rob would say to that.
Interesting.
Yeah, and this is Jenny. And I think I was part of the MS ISAC, and if anybody is not part of that, if you're in government, you can get free access to that. So it's MS-ISAC, and they have a bunch of different areas. But I was part of the weekly call, and that had membership from a lot of the federal agencies going through this, the PPE and finding it. One issue that came up that nobody had really anticipated was the shipping of PPE over state lines, because there were some states that were prohibiting any kind of shipping across state lines. And this group was able to facilitate that and get the shipments out across state lines. So I think I would try to draft the question not in an accusatory way, because I don't think the federal government had ever dealt with this. But from what we had seen, what they did develop, which was a benefit of a horrible situation, was a cross-nation collaboration with the states. And I know there was some competition that came up, and a lot of states that were angry. But I think understanding how they made the prioritization of critical need is something that states also need to understand, because that really wasn't communicated. We understood it being part of this group because they said if you met a certain percentage of people dying in hospitals and hospitals not being able to function, they were moved up to the top of the list. Now, if there was a state that was in the middle of the list and they were angry because they couldn't get the PPE that they wanted, that's understandable. But the feds were making it from a completely different perspective. So I think understanding how the federal perspective and the state perspective works in these emergency situations and the collaboration that was developed and is also needed on a future basis, that's a really interesting conversation, Dustin. Jenny out.
I want to remind you guys that we do these every other Wednesday, as everyone on this stage is a busy person, and we try to make sure that we're not over committing to things so that we can actually deliver some good content. I get a surprising number of people that tell me that they enjoy these. So I want to thank all you guys for the time that you give for free. I remember about 3 months ago, I told Jamie, I have a fantastic idea about how you can give me several hours a month for free and you're going to love it. And lo and behold.
And here we are sharing all of our wonderful knowledge with the world.
Great. Okay, with that, I want to thank you guys for being in. If you're not connected with me on LinkedIn, please find me on LinkedIn. That's where we do most of our content communication distribution. So with that, thank you guys very much and have a great rest of your day. Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent.